We should be seeing stuff. Sorry about that, folks. It's okay. All you missed was a character of me, so no worries.
Looks just like you, Joe.
It does. So the way we're going to approach this today, this is not going to be very demo heavy. And the reason for that, in fact, I'm shooting for no demos, quite frankly, today. Sorry to disappoint, but really I want to get into the mind of Tablix here. And we're going to discuss things that are based on an interesting discussion I had with a good friend of mine, fellow reporting services co-author, and the developer at Microsoft who implemented the Tablix within the new 2008 on-demand processing engine in reporting services. And that is Robert Bruckner. I asked him point blank one time, if you had to list the top 10 things you'd expect people to know or understand about the Tablix, what would those be? So today we're going to cover much of the list that Robert provided us. In addition, you'll see on the right-hand side there are other things we're not going to hit today. I really can't do justice to all of those in this short time frame, and those could indeed be full-length webinars in their own right. Those things would include parent-child hierarchies from reporting service, from analysis services, the use of the actual defined server aggregates from the cubes in analysis services versus aggregating within reporting services, and the new lookup functions that allow data sets to communicate or retrieve values from other data sets in reporting services. Those were important on his list, but we won't hit those today. We'll quickly preview what Tablix is and the anatomy. Then we'll look at some of these top 10, things like stepped layout, subtotaling, multiple subtotaling specifically, dynamic drill-through actions, etc., etc. So let's jump in. First, Tablix. What is it? The official term actually was generated because it essentially combines the features that were previously separate data regions within reporting services, both 2000 and 2005 editions. So the term Tablix is formed by combining table and matrix. The value add here is quite simple. It gives us the capability of designing with one particular data region that can morph into the others as needed. One of the challenges we had oftentimes with our designs in 2000 2005 is we may have gone down one path to use either the table or the matrix region, realized after we got into it that, wow, we needed to go back and use the other region. And that, for those of you who have experienced that, was not the most comfortable experience in the world. So the idea is if they're all combined in one particular data region object, they have similar functionality and capabilities and can effectively reproduce the layout designs that would be unique to a table or unique to a matrix. What's interesting to note is in reporting services, under the covers, all the data regions that are available, list, chart, gauge, even custom ones if you create them, under the covers are all in the engine of reporting services manifested as Tablix. And as a result of this, we also get powerful new features. In the top corner, we get a grid that does reflect our row columns, and we get side-by-side adjacent groups, which we'll talk to here momentarily how useful and powerful that is. And we have additional row layout options that were not available to us without some degree of trickery, most notably a stepped group, or AKA, in my terminology, the word outline-esque type layout, and explicit defined subtotals. This was a lifesaver for many things that we were trying to accomplish with reporting services. So let's dive into the anatomy, and I'm going to blow through these pretty quickly, but I don't feel that we can do justice to this Tablix without understanding some of these details. And I know from personal experience that, well, quite frankly, depending on your mindset individually out there, you know, we often learn and approach learning technology in different ways. And I can't presume to know what your favorite way to learn that technology is. But oftentimes, if you're like me, it's kind of, well, let's open this up and start playing with it. When I approached the Tablix that way for the first time, I met some rather unusual experiences and pretty quickly discovered that I really kind of needed to understand a little bit more about how I needed to visually understand what was being put forth on the page here. So the keys here are how we deal with detail and group data. Specific to groups, we have the notion that they're hierarchical, parent-child, if you will, and that those hierarchies exist not only on rows but also on columns as well. And that there are 4 specific data region areas you have to be aware of as you work with Tablix. You have the body, which is the common construct that has detail rows and some of your summaries, etc. That's usually the specific data that's being rendered directly out of your data sets. You have row groups that are going to devise the hierarchy, the parent-child relationships, if applicable, to render different groupings of subtotals or columns in that space. And then, of course, column groups, which do the similar function for columns. That gives us the unique capabilities to put side-by-side nested groups that is so powerful. And we have the corner, which gives us another area which I often find is quite underused in some of the reporting that I see designed out there. But that also is a valid cell area able to be used. And then there's the concept of static and dynamic rows and columns, which we'll deal with. The key concept here to understand is that as you're designing your layouts, and again, it all fits in the realm of this Tablix, that the detailed light items are going to be represented directly from the data source in your data sets. The aggregates, the summaries, if you will, are going to be organized into those groups both on columns and rows. And an additional construct here to keep in mind is that by default, each of these Tablix cells will contain essentially a text box. But that's not the only capability you have within those particular cells. So text box is the default, but that could easily be an image. It could be another data region, so you could go wild nesting Tablixes within Tablixes within Tablixes. More commonly, though, you'll see charts or gauges nested in cells. And sometimes you'll see multiple nested in one cell, and we accomplish that with using a rectangle container. Rectangle container will group different objects together within a particular cell in a Tablix.
Joe?
Okay. So, yes.
Joe, I'm sorry. We have a really quick question from one of the audience members.
Good.
One of the questions is, I don't remember seeing a Tablix in Reporting Services 2005. Does it only exist in higher versions, and if so, which ones?
That would be correct. 2008, 2008 R2.
Great, thank you.
Right. Good question. Yep, that was the major difference in how the reporting services architecture changed starting with 2008. Okay. Just drilling into details, the reason I wanted to highlight or show these is to also emphasize what when I was new to this, struggled with. And that was some of the visual representations and stuff that you have here. Some of us tend to go along and plod along in technology and never even notice that, wow, they actually built some markers here to help us. So I wanted to at least highlight some of these so that if you haven't been exposed to these, you can see. The highlight, if you'll notice, is actually surrounding the quantity. And so the innermost group indicator is actually the little yellow bar that surrounds the product column there. The reason that's important is it's yellow to indicate what actually has your context presently. So that's the active, if you will. The other gray ones that you see on the outsides of order and date just simply indicate those are also row groups that are representing different other capabilities there of that particular design. And then also in an area that I guess within Excel would represent either your columns, A, B, C, or your row numbers, 1, 2, etc. Those areas also contain very useful information that give you some visual indicators of parent-child groupings there. So important to highlight these so that as you begin to design these, you can realize that these visual indicators help you to show which groups belong to which groups and which cells belong to which groups, etc. Then when we look at rows and the total rows, excuse me, in grouping, we get yet more visual indicators. Unlike the previous one, this particular sample shows that now we have column groups, and you notice a very similar design in how they represent the nested or hierarchy parent-child groupings, if you will. One thing to note about the specific design that's illustrated here is this is an example of the nested groups. And we'll talk more detail what that means potentially, but the easiest way I can explain it here is that geography is at the same level as year. So year is not a child of geography. Country region is a child of geography, but year sits side by side that geography. That gives us that capability of showing multiple complex groupings of that data in one single report side by side, if you will. And of course, it's showing you all the good stuff like all the different handles that you can use for resizing and moving. What's not reflected here too is there's very rich capabilities with right-click to move things, to shuffle them around this design of the Tablix that's available there. And at the bottom, we're looking at the grouping designer. Often this is the easiest way that you can manipulate some of this design. For me, it makes a little bit more sense because it's more like that outline in Word that helps you construct what levels report to what levels. It uses indentation to show what is a child of a parent. So in the example of the row groups, it's showing the subcategory is related to the parent category. And on the column groups, it emphasizes what I just described earlier, where geography and year are at the same level, and country and region rolls up to geography. Again, drag and drop, we can reorient those for the particular report design that we're attempting to accomplish. The other important thing to understand is how the cells operate. Again, this is that concept of those 4 areas that we talked about earlier and how they relate to your designs. Because it's part of one of these 4 cells, you can potentially display any value in your data set in each of these regions. Also, of course, static text can be displayed in these regions. The default function that's usually applied when you drag and drop something from your data set to one of these regions is determined by its location. So obviously if I drop a column, as it's illustrating in this example, into a subtotal area where it's already grouped, for example, by category or subcategory, it by default will wrap it in a sum function for us.
Joe, we had another question.
Yes.
The question was, how do you get to the grouping designer?
Okay, the grouping designer should there are 2 design tools. Let's talk about that for just a quick moment. So there are 2 design tools. There's Visual Studio and there's Report Builder. In Report Builder, I often think that's the easy experience to design these. There's actually a pane at the bottom of the designer that should show those. If it's not displayed, you'll want to look under some of your options, I believe View, to make sure that that pane is enabled. But that is the easiest view of that. Good question.
Yep, Visual Studio was the environment that they're working in.
Okay. Off the top of my head, I'm driving mentally in my head and I can't figure out how that actually gets displayed there. There's a similar pane for viewing that information too inside Visual Studio.
It's usually located down at the bottom.
It usually is, yes. Again, I apologize. I unfortunately don't have the Visual Studio interface memorized enough to direct you there. I want to say it's on the View menu, though, or an RS menu. Honestly, can't say which. So the key concept, obviously, is that the actual data displayed for each cell is evaluated by the expression for the report item that the cell is going to contain. Again, typically our text boxes that I described earlier. So in a cell that belongs to our detail row or column, the expression will default to just flat out that detailed data, a static value, if you will, directly from the data set. Okay. In a cell that does not belong to a detail row or column, our expression will default again to an appropriate aggregate function. I believe it will use some in most, if not all cases by default. Doesn't mean you're left with the sum. Obviously, you can change that, but in an effort to be helpful, it knows that if I'm in a grouping, I obviously need to perform some kind of aggregate to reflect that data appropriately. It's important to note, by the way, that sometimes we actually do want, it does count as an aggregate function when you do things like a first or a last. So even though that won't officially, quote unquote, aggregate the data together some way or count it or average it, that also does count as an aggregate operator, and a lot of report designers miss that they can use a last or a first capability as well. Okay, so, and also there's the concept where we can merge cells together as needed to represent layouts. That obviously is more typically found in some of the header areas than it is in your details of the report. And the converse is capable too. You can split cells that were previously merged. And this functionality is very similar to what the capabilities were for us in Excel, as far as the use case for doing that, as well as how it's actually accomplished. Let's hit some of the key points now, shall we, that were on our top 10. Stepped layout. What you're seeing depicted here are the two basic types of layouts that we have for this. The top one is our regular blocked layout. And as you can see, we have our product and our subcategory, product being component, subcategory being that nested group of bottom brackets, breaks, and chains. Now, there's nothing to say either one of these layouts is right or wrong, but you obviously have specific use cases for these. The biggest difference that you see between the two obviously is in the lower example, which is our stepped layout, that we're conserving a significant amount of space by doing it in this manner. One little tip that I will give you, however, is unfortunately when you go with a stepped layout, it basically assigns, and I forget the specific report property it does this, but it assigns a level to these. I believe it's zero based, so components at the product level would have a 0 value for that. The subcategory represented by those bottom brackets, etc., would have a 1 value associated with that. Reporting services all the way up until the recent R2 release does not give us as designers the capability of changing the padding or the tabbing effect that you're seeing there as far as the width of that when you opt for that view, that step layout view. So in other words, if I decided that was a little too aggressive of an amount of padding for that bottom brackets level and I wanted less, I don't have an easy way to change that. Alternatively though, if you know you only have 2 groups as this report represents and you don't like it, we can set those values to 0, essentially disabling reporting services ability to automatically indent for us, and then we can manually take that level and add our own padding. Again, it only works when you have specific fixed levels being represented in your report, but I at least wanted to throw that out because that was one area that gave me a lot of headaches. Is I don't like the amount of tabbing there. Can I change that?
Joe, we have a couple more questions.
Yeah. Sorry. Yes, go ahead, please.
The first question we have is there a setting to never merge cells?
Wow, I'm not aware of that one. No.
Okay.
That's an interesting use case, though. I'd like to hear more about that use case.
Okay.
To never merge them. Good question.
The second question that we have is, yes, the second question that we have is how do you pick a stepped layout without using any of the wizards?
Oh, good question. Man, you guys are great, and you're anticipating. So, right. The moral of the story is if you've ever wanted to do this design, obviously using the wizard, easiest, because, well, it prompts you, do you want the stepped layout or do you want the regular block layout? And then, of course, you can apply all those hideous colors that they have on the palette, etc. But, good point, leading to what I was just going to talk about. There are manual steps where you can convert to or from these different types. It's not very intuitive, and there are several good blogs that would go on that. That would be something I'd rather demo than actually walk you guys through on the call today. But just suffice it to say, there are some specific steps to do that. Carolyn Chow, who was the head, or still is, I guess, the head of Report Builder, has some great information on that if you search for her name. And then what you want to search for ultimately is convert from regular blocked. And then there's some good ideas around that. I've also had customers that did something even more complex, where if you looked at that bottom step layout, they essentially had a third level that they didn't want stepped, and they wanted nested beside, in this example, the product and the subcategory. And that was a pretty complicated design, and ultimately it had to do with setting a pretty obscure setting that said for the next level, do not place within that column or that nesting, or excuse me, that stepped, and then that would force it. But not very intuitive, but just to give you the idea of the possible, right? Multiple subtotals. This was a huge win for those of us who had to report, as the example shows on the top, where we wanted to show both sales and average. This was extraordinarily complicated previously because we had to use some complicated in-scope functions, which behind the scenes were a way of figuring out in reporting services at runtime, where are we and what does the calculation actually need to be. Use the word hack if you like there. But now with 2008, reporting services significantly different with the Tablix because we get those explicit cell definitions for each of the aggregation areas. So we don't need to figure out where we are to determine what expression to use. We just simply define them, and we can define as many subtotals at every grouping level, row or column, that we want. So in our example again, we have some sales, we could have % of total revenue, year-over-year growth, whatever's appropriate to our business need or use case. So the example that you see at the bottom is a fantastic one where, you know, here we are doing subtotal calculations side by side under the order year group. So we got year total, we got year-over-year growth %, we got a KPI image showing the growth trend, up, down, flat, etc. And as you see too, these subtotals can use the different styles, layouts, heights, width, visualizations, etc. A lot of power to this particular design that's illustrated here. Shrinking table widths, two stories here. Within 2008, we have now the ability to dynamically hide table columns. There were some tricks to do this previously, but like I said, they were pretty complicated tricks that didn't necessarily play out as we would have expected them to. So we can dynamically hide table columns and shrink the width of the table, which would also affect your report body, automatically. Okay, so we can have the ability now just to hide the contents, but not actual the table column and preserve the space, or as you see in the top design, this is a simple example where we just want to hide the column. And this uses just simply the visibility hidden property on that column. And so we're going to hide the contents inside the column, not the column itself. The problem with this design, or, you know, again, I say problem, but this could be the desired effect. As you can see on the right, the challenge here is even though that was hidden, we still have space. Okay. The bottom solution is the correct response for handling that scenario where we do want to give people dynamic capability, so to speak, to determine, for example, what columns they want to show. In this example, they optionally can choose middle name, display, or not. What they've chosen to do is create a parameter on their report. And so what is selected there at the bottom is the static column group that corresponds to middle name. In the report sample here, we don't have official subtotal groups by anything, so all we're dealing with are details. So those static groups are corresponding, you know, left to right, to the top to bottom display that you see in the column groups. So the middle one being selected for middle name. On the right, you see the Tablix member properties being displayed there. Mental note for all of you guys, this also means you also have to activate that little corner tab on that to activate the advanced mode to see this information. Once that's activated, though, we can set that hidden property as it's illustrated there to that parameter. So when they choose to display the middle name, it'll show, or in the example shown on the far right, they've opted not to display the middle name, and it simply hides not only the data values, but it conserves the space by removing the physical column and shrinking the report width as well.
Joe, we have another question.
Yes.
The shrinking of the table widths, is that not possible in 2005, or will it take coding?
That's a good question. Obviously not if you use the method that we showed in the first step, because it will reserve that space and not be able to collapse that. There were some tricks that we could do, I seem to recall, where we would do some parameterization that would then feed which columns need to be displayed, and I believe that did shrink the report width. So it's really not to say that it's not possible in 2005 and before as much as it is a situation where this was a little bit more intuitive. But I would agree that there was some degree of code. I don't want to say code in the sense that you're doing Visual Basic type code, but there were some tricks that we could employ, not as intuitive as this experience with the Tablix. Now, anything prior to 2008, remember, the advice depends on whether you're dealing with a table or a matrix. Matrix was a very complex proposition to do that. And the table was a little bit easier to do that. So good questions. Fields in the page header. So another part of 2008 thing that came out was our ability to directly reference these dataset fields and even the aggregations from expressions that we have in our page headers and footers, etc. And we simply have to drag that dataset field into the page header footer area, and it wires it up. So in the example that we have here, they did some interesting things by using like a count distinct for the country value for customers, indicating, you know, hey, you got 21 customers in 21 countries. You see the common, you know, previous versions of RS could do this, but the page X of X. But even more exciting was they were able to do, and I alluded to this earlier, right? They did a first and a last to determine within this page context what is the first and last country that's being displayed. Unfortunately, your display doesn't have the whole report page, but trust me when I say Denmark is at the end of this particular page. But the idea is that gives us kind of that telephone book indexing look and feel to be able to just flip through pages quickly and easily using some kind of reference indexing like that. Pretty valuable trick. Also of note on here was also new to 2008, they have that rich text box. So here we were able to combine bold, etc. You know, you can go a little too wild, but the idea is you can use the multiple font styles, colors, etc. within the exact same text box. Previously, to do that, we had to get really, really creative in laying text boxes on top and doing all kinds of stuff to accomplish that. And of course, we are seeing between country and city that stepped layout that we just discussed earlier.
Joe, just to bring up a quick question or a point that somebody's making, the comment that they made said, every report I develop, I have to modify the advanced property to get the column headings to appear on all pages of the report. So I don't know if you've had experience with that, but I certainly have, and unfortunately that's a bug in reporting services. And
interesting.
yeah, so normally you would think that you would go to the Tablix properties and right-click and then select to repeat on column headers and to scroll as you scroll down the page, but you have to use that advanced tab to set the static value.
Set it.
Yep.
Yeah.
And you have to go in there and turn them to true, and then that's the only way to get them to repeat or to scroll with you.
Right. Not intuitive.
No.
I would concur. Yeah.
So big
interesting
bug.
Though, yeah, and interesting. If Sherry, I guess if you can shoot me an email with that just to remind me, I'd be interested to see if there's actually a Connect bug on that. For Microsoft Connect is where folks can report bugs or, well, just plain unpleasant experiences they've had with different products. And it's important, perhaps after this we can share those details, but Connect is very important. I can speak from experience because the product team for Microsoft for all the different products really do evaluate those because, I mean, they may not fix them all. I can't promise that, folks, but at the end of the day, they often use that as a prioritization list for features or enhancements or things that they need to deal with in next iterations of products.
Yeah,
So
that's a good point.
That's
an awesome point. And I had that question during one of my reporting services class, and there's a blog that I've written about it on BIDN about scrolling column headers. So definitely feel free to go out there and take a look at the different properties to set for it, which takes us into another audience question for you, Joe.
Yes.
Let's see. It says repeating column headers during export to Word rarely works, no matter the static settings. Word nests too many rectangles upon export. Any comments or ideas? None for me.
Yeah, I've kind of played with that. Use PDF? No, I'm just teasing. Yeah, kind of funny that PDF usually works better for that scenario. I think the challenge really, though, with Word is you've got to understand the underlying technology base. So the one thing you always have to be aware of with reporting services and really just about any tool is that there's always database layout and rendering-based layouts. But what people often miss too is there's a hierarchy of those all as well. And quite simply put, Word is not what we would call a, I'm not a graphic designer by any stretch, but it's not a pixel perfect design layout experience. An example of that would be Publisher. Publisher, it's like how we design our reports, right? We drag regions, we resize regions, we move text regions even around when we do Publisher. And that's part of the challenge you face when you're exporting to Word, unfortunately. I would argue, though, that they've gotten so much better with how that goes over to Word and Excel. And part of that was because they actually acquired a company to help that was basically building an add-on product for that capability. And they purchased them to acquire that kind of technology set. Again, great feedback, and Connect is a great place to circulate or bubble that up so that that remains on their radar screen. And specific to the exports, they do like to hear from you folks to know what those different use cases are, because for anyone who's worked in software or played with software, you really need help from your customer base to understand how the product's being actually used in the field in order so that they can to address those. So good feedback and ideas, folks. Dynamic drill through, I'm not going to go into great detail on this, but the idea was this. This is a very hidden advanced capability. And the example that I'm showing is kind of humorous, but reporting services team every year for their different conference circuits deploys usually a pretty wild, way out there report that you would never expect as a report. They've done a game of Hangman, they've done Battleship, which is what's being illustrated here. And the idea was here that how do you do expression-based dynamic drill-through reports? Very powerful feature. It has been in reporting services since the very beginning, but it's very powerful. So the idea is not just, can I hard code a report to launch here and perhaps pass in parameters, as you can see with the add and delete, to run that, but is there a capability of determining what to run, or as the case illustrates here, whether to run anything? in the Battleship game, the design experience was such that you could click a cell coordinate one time, but they did not want the capability of allowing you to multiple click it, which makes sense if you're familiar with the game of Battleship. You know, you can't call C3 10 times and have any meaningful interaction. So this was just illustrating the fact that to make this happen even easier in 2008, I guess it was R2, we also have variables, but I guess that's not really specific to this. But global's bang operator or exclamation point report name, the trick is that that represents always the name of the current report. So in the syntax he had there in the if statement, the last parameter value is what to go to, and here he's saying if it's clicked, drill to yourself. So sounds kind of funny, but that's essentially what it's doing, is it wants it to drill to itself with that parameter so that it does not drill to something else. Obviously this is a bit of an obscure sample. What would be useful for you guys out there oftentimes is parent-child recursive grouping hierarchies. So, you know, depending on where you are in that hierarchy or whatever, conditionally being able to drill through to different target reports based on where somebody is in the hierarchy. So you can give that specific context for the information they were viewing at in your report.
Joe, we had another question regarding
Yes.
the Connect site. You mentioned somebody was interested in finding out what that was.
Okay. Again, it's just a simple, it's a website maintained by Microsoft officially that allows you to report bugs or feature requests, essentially. I don't have the URL, so if you don't mind poking around for that,
Okay.
Sherry, that would be useful for us to share here at the end.
Okay.
And the other important thing for all of you out there is it's not only just a place where you can report and obviously to raise those feature requests, but it's also a good place to look if you're experiencing a real oddity out there. And I'm not saying it'll solve that, but if you've really come to grips with the reality that, wow, this just doesn't seem right, that's a good place to look to see if people have reported something similar. And more importantly, at least in my book, is it also gives you the ability to vote out there. So, and again, they do take that into consideration. So if they get a connect bug on that page header experience or the Word export experience that has just a truckload of votes, they will give that very serious consideration.
One more question.
Yes.
We have a very engaged audience, so this is great.
We do. Great job, guys.
So the question that they have was, let's say I'm grouping by year and 2011 starts on page 1 and finishes on page 2. At the top of page 2, I would like to say 2011 continued. Is there a way to do that?
Oh, yes, there are some tricks to that. I'm not going to be able to respond to that directly here. Suffice to say that absolutely can be done. I believe we even had a recipe similar to that in the recipe book, quite frankly. It escapes me which one, but absolutely that's possible. So it's going to extend beyond just the use of first and last. And that would be part of that equation, certainly. But absolutely there is. That may be something we could blog about on BIDN.
Sounds like a great topic for you, Joe.
Yeah. Yeah. Encourage me to blog. Way to go, guys. So reset page number on group. Okay, again, R2 feature and beyond, 2008 R2 that is. So we can actually reset our page numbers within a report based on a change in the group value. We can also name pages, which you'll see why that's going to be important here shortly. And we can dynamically, we can define dynamic page breaks and optionally reset those page numbers. So the idea is basically people got tired of, I just want pages 1 to 100. What if I want to do it within a particular grouping of the report, etc. So as you can see in the report sample in the yellow highlighted area, we're actually showing two different page groupings there for the product catalog page overall, and also for the bikes subsection which we're displaying. So this is page 1 of 3 for the bikes, right? And it's kind of showing you how that's actually accomplished. They have this page break section, and it has, I'm not going to go into all the gory details of all the options that you have here, but the moral of the story is this whole section, including the page name, is very valuable for different things. And you can see, of course, at the bottom how they actually coded up that area that we saw in the yellow box based upon that. So that then has the appropriate reference to what they call the overall page number in total pages versus the page number in standard total pages type of referencing.
Joe, with that being said, how would you set a dynamic page break?
More advanced. You know, that's one I'm going to have to punt on for today because I won't get to the rest, but very good question. A dynamic page break can be set, I believe it has to do with, see how we have break location there, start and end? I believe that also takes an expression. Again, gang, I'm shooting totally from the hip on remembering that. But I think that's expressionable. You like that term? Expressionable. Meaning that like we have page name indicated there, we're not assigning it a specific value, we're giving it a conditional formula to evaluate to actually do that naming. I believe, if I'm not mistaken, that the break location has that capability as well.
Okay, great. And the expressions that you're using for your examples, will those be made available for the audience?
This entire presentation deck will be complete with some notes for you guys and some references.
Great, thank you.
Very good question. Yeah. Unfortunately, I don't have full worked out demos of these reports, but I can also send you guys to, Robert has actually prepared some of these as samples that I'll share with you guys too, that you can play with. Okay, one of my favorite, because I've struggled with this, render dependent layout. Well, what does this mean? Well, it means let's write less reports, folks. At the end of the day, often we have a goal that we want to author something once, right? And we want to have the ability to render it both to export formats, to viewing online, et cetera, et cetera. And we really want to target the appropriate renderer with the information that we want for that renderer. So in other words, if we're dealing with an export format for data, we really could care less about pictures and a lot of the visual design elements that we would develop on a standard report. Whereas if we're building it for an interactive experience or for a dashboard, etc., we want the visualizations and stuff because they add value and aid in the navigation and understanding of what's being presented, right? So the huge benefit is they've built a lot of capabilities surrounding that to where it just works. We don't have to worry about how report items and certain styles that we select are going to translate to the viewing experience online versus Word, Excel, PDF. Not saying it's perfect, folks, but it's not bad that they gave us the ability that you can see even in this sample, right? This is the exact same report shown interactively in the viewer on the web and the same report exported to Excel. So even though those are radically different, that was done basically without a lot of effort on the designer's part. Certainly there are decisions you have to make, but they do a pretty good job about getting it right. Now there are those situations where you have to be even more granular in how you want to control that behavior. And so again, 2008 R2 introduced the ability to make those decisions based on the rendering format. And the way they did that was you can access the rendering extension registered in the config file by a globals reference. So globals bang render format.name. And more importantly, they actually have a Boolean flag associated with a is interactive property of that render format. So globals bang render format .is interactive, which of course you can use in formula. So you can determine whether at runtime a user is accessing your report through your browser, etc., or through other mechanisms, and then respond accordingly. Okay, so we can then use that information in formatting expressions, for example, the key is, though, we cannot use it in the data processing. So grouping, sorting, filtering, those kind of things are calculated once. Those aren't part of the rendering process. Okay, but how we choose to display information can be handled if you need that more granular control by that. So when is that important to use that type of scenario where you want that complex formatting and interactivity targeted for those different ones? Well, maybe for print, right? So for print, you may want to add or omit text disclaimers, logos, etc. PDF, Excel, Word, maybe you want to dynamically disable hyperlinks when the report's exported. Maybe for print, you want to define a particular color palette for the different rendering formats. But when you want to use it for print, let's just do grayscale or black and white for that matter. So again, the sample that you're seeing there is just showing Excel and HTML view of the same report side by side. Okay, naming Excel worksheets. A lot of folks love to use reporting services as a pseudo ETL tool, and I don't blame them, because at the end of the day, it's a nice way to organize and get the data that is required. Not suggesting the best use of a report, but it works. And flat out, many people in finance especially can tell you that getting data into Excel is of paramount importance to them. So that being said, one of the challenges we've always had is, wow, wouldn't it be cool if we could just name these bloody pages after we export? And so R2 gives us the capability to define data-dependent names for those worksheets. And you saw that formula I had before, and you're going to see it here in the bottom example there. By assigning those fields to, in this case, category was the bikes, and picking up that value enabled when we exported it to then have bikes be the tab name, or the worksheet name or tab name within Excel. So it gave us the ability to either hard code that or to allow that to be dynamic based on groups, so that if we exported each group into a different tab or page in the report, then we would see accessories, bikes, clothing, and components as is illustrated right here. So the report page, the key here to all this, right, folks, is that the report page names now determine those names of those worksheets. So if you dynamically handle that through this property, you'll handle that export automatically and make all your users love you. Okay. Yeah, Sherry, more questions?
Yes, I do.
You guys are great.
So one of the questions that we had was, where do you find the page break property in 2008?
Oh, that's a good question. I think it's at the Tablix level. So if the Tablix properties are set, I believe it's part of that. I'm not remembering off the top of my head, though, if that's accurate. We'll have to check that out. Okay.
And then there was another question about how do you link a color palette to a report or a style. The person who asked had never actually found the way to do that.
That's actually very good. I'm going to have to punt on that. I'm sorry, because that is, it's been made easier for reporting services, but it really is a rather complex process to describe over our call today. Sherry, if you'll make a note, that would be also a great blog.
Yep, absolutely.
And we'll take care of that on BIDN, because that is a very good one. And we do, by the way, in our services, have that happen more times than you guys think out there. I can share an interesting story related to that I actually went to one of the chip manufacturers one time. Will remain nameless which one. But suffice it to say, they have different colors. One's blue and orange, and one's green and black or purple. And it doesn't matter which one you go to, if you did any work for them, you would quickly discover that, well, they don't want to use their competitors' palettes at all. And so if you walk into the one and show a graph with orange and blue, they're not going to be very happy. Now, I know that seems a little drastic, but the idea is, though, the same, that it is very useful to have those palettes set up for your company colors or common iterations of those so that you can be consistent throughout. So I applaud the user for bringing that up, because that is a kind of subtle thing. And the other thing it quite frankly solves those, I know one person particularly on the call that's an advocate of this, but when you're talking about visual design of proper perceptual, human perception-based design out there, sometimes those default colors that charts and graphs picks are hideous combinations that make it very challenging to understand the data that you're working so hard through your designs to present. So that's another very good use for those custom palettes, is to make ones that when the charts and graphs and stuff are rendered, will actually pick better choice colors for giving meaning to those, versus ones that would just be like a disco, I guess, for lack of a better description there. But the interesting thing about naming Excel worksheets, and the reason I put this in this point in the presentation, was simple, because this also required two concepts that we just talked about. Number one was naming the report pages that dealt with resetting page number on group, and rendering dependent report layouts that we talked about in rendering those dependent layouts. So this kind of combines both of those concepts together to make this happen. Okay. That being said, I'm open for questions. I want to give you guys a little bit of time here before we wrap up. I appreciate your attention today, and by all means, come back and visit us on the T's, as it were, Tuesday and Thursday. We love having you guys, and we appreciate your feedback to provide content that's interesting to you folks out there.
Okay, so it looks like we have another question. The question is, can you do a page break in the header?
I don't believe so. Header will apply either to the overall report or a particular data region it's associated with. I'm not sure there's a way to accomplish that. I'd be interested to know the use case. I'm assuming maybe you're going for something like perhaps putting a table of contents or something like that before data, most of the report data would render. And if so, there are actual patterns to accomplishing that as well. Curious to the use case around that.
Okay. Our next question is, and they're starting to really fly in here now, but so one of the attendees wanted to know if they're developing a report with R2 features and then they deploy it to a machine that has just 2008, will the report still work?
Short answer, no. Long answer, perhaps. So, gotta love that, right? You can protect yourself. I apologize, I don't know where that setting is. But you can protect yourself as a designer if you know that's going to be the situation. There is the capability, I'm pretty sure in both Visual Studio, but definitely in Report Builder, where you can lock that down to features only in that particular reporting set, so you kind of keep yourself out of trouble. Absent that, if you've actually designed it, it will not work with the down level reporting engine. So it may make common sense, but a 2008 report can work in both 2008 and 2008 R2. But a 2008 report, if it has any new or specific features, would not be able to be deployed and run on 2005. In fact, you can't even deploy it there because it will check the RDL syntax and say, even if you haven't used the features, it won't allow that. So it's not the Excel-based experience where, sometimes you can open a higher level Excel file in a lower level Excel. It just may disable certain things. Presently, the way they have that worked out is you wouldn't be able to deploy that to a down-level reporting services instance.
Okay. Another question we have is, can you export reporting services reports to Excel 2007 or 2010 in the .xlsx format?
Not presently supported. It will leverage whatever's on the machines, but there's not a separate XLS versus XLSX, if I got that right. I can never remember where the X is in the middle or the end of that, but suffice to say there's not a specific rendering extension for both. So the experience is it will open up as to whatever specific Office level that they have, if that makes sense. Key to note, though, as a sidebar there, though, be aware that there is a huge difference. I know you guys are pretty sharp out there, but I'll say it nonetheless. There is a huge difference between Excel export, which, believe it or not, is a report format renderer, and the CSV layout, which is a data-only renderer. If you export Excel, it will try to copy it visually as close as it can in your Excel spreadsheet, including, and this is pretty cool actually, including any collapsible, drill down capabilities you've built in your report. It will try to reproduce those in your Excel workbook.
Okay, so they're saying if it's not possible to create to do that, is it possible to create a custom export in the export drop-down box?
Absolutely. I haven't had experience with designing one that would accomplish that. But yes, so the renderers and the exports are part of reporting services that are able to be customized through extensions that could be written, purchased, added on, so that it can support both sources, rendering, like I said, and export capabilities can be added on to that.
Okay. Do you know of any way to create a pivot table in Excel from reporting services, not just grouping and outlining, but a full pivot table?
Wow, that's a good question. I know in Power Pivot, Power Pivot, which is, well, we'll just leave it as pivot table on steroids, so to speak. But those pivot tables can actually reference a report section as a source directly. And it does throw through setting, you have the capability of making sections or regions of your report design exposable. This is probably going to lose a lot of you folks, and don't worry, I'm just throwing out the answer, and the techie of you can figure this. But you can basically create data feeds out of the different regions of a report, and those can be consumed by tools that can consume those data feeds. And that would be probably my best tip for you to kind of explore that, is that would be the only way that I'm aware of that could be consumed, even by a traditional pivot table. They did have some examples, I know, for pivot tables where they were connecting to certain weather data feeds, for example, and stuff like that you could use as a sample. So two parts. One is figure out how you would be able to wire up a data feed based on the report itself, and the second would be to figure out the syntax you would need in the pivot table side to use a data feed as a source. But that's kind of the pattern that would have to be employed there.
Okay. If you now you're going to have to follow this one with me, Joe, okay? If you have a server that has 2008 R2, but the data sits on a 2005 server, can you get the data from within 2008 R2 and deploy the 2005 data to the 2008 R2 server?
Okay, so yeah, let's talk about this for a little bit. If we're talking the data sources for the report, a 2005 report can reference 2008 data. Okay, so we're not talking about consuming sources when we talk about compatibility. We're only talking about what reporting features, components, etc. are available when we talk about compatibility. So in other words, I can, in a 2005 report, I can still reference a 2008 SQL Server instance that has my data, if that makes sense. I just cannot deploy a 2008 report, meaning a 2008 reporting services report, back down to a 2005 reporting services instance of a server. Does that help clarify that a little bit?
Cindy said that it's no.
Oh, sorry, Cindy.
Okay, so Cindy, I think he'll have to actually read the question and process that just a little bit, and then we'll have to send an email to you on that one. The next question that we have is, can you link a predefined Excel template to a reporting or SSRS export to Excel? So let me repeat that. Can you link a predefined Excel template to an SSRS export to Excel? And it says native Excel formatting tends to not be very precise.
Yeah, I'm not aware of how to do that without, as another caller had introduced, without creating a custom extension.
Okay. Let's see.
Good idea for a product, thought.
Let's see. How can you use reporting services C#? Are there any links to webinars that I can take a look at?
So just backing up a bit, why would we use C# versus VB, etc.? So, and where do we? Traditionally, that's used in two ways in a report, potentially. One is there's a code window that allows you to put custom functions and custom code, basically, that you can leverage in your report there. Once that code is actually placed in that window, there's a whole code collection, if you will, similar to how we have the globals collection and the parameters collection. There's a code collection that is used to reference those functions that you add to your report. So the idea is, can you use VB and C# there? As far as, my understanding is those are now both supported for that use. And the more advanced usage scenario is I could actually create that code, not put it in the code window, but put it outside the report and in a common library, if you will, and then that code window would only have to make reference to that library in order to use all the different functions or whatever I wire up in there. And that could be written in the part that I'm absolutely sure of is that code library can be written in any language that's able to be referenced. So that one is completely agnostic to whatever reporting services supports, as long as it's callable from reporting services. If you code within the code window, I thought C# was available. I may be mistaken on that, and it may only be VB.net. And certainly all the expressions that you would code within reporting services is essentially reporting services syntax for their function language, which is more VB-esque than it would be C#-esque, if you will.
Okay, well, we have still more questions coming in. We'll ask 2 more questions, and then we'll go ahead and wrap up today's webinar due to the time. The next question that we have is, how come when you export a report into a CSV, it renames all your columns? For example, customer name becomes customer underscore name. Blanks are replaced with underscores.
Yeah, that has to do with Excel. and potentially how it wants to manage that. Again, that kind of ties back to the question of, it's an interesting thought. So I've seen design patterns around that. The moral of the story is it's designed into the export renderer that they built. And the only way to automatically deal with that on your own would be to have to, unfortunately, roll your own extension. But another possible workaround there is you can dynamically name those columns based on the trick that I gave you earlier. So in other words, if somebody chooses to export it, it could potentially intercept that, and instead of adding the underscore, I guess perhaps I guess the underscore would still be introduced. I was thinking maybe we could, if you did care for the underscore and would alternatively want to just kind of put right next to one another without any space or underscore, I think you might be able to intercept that based on the rendering format and deal with it. But aside from that, what you're seeing there is the default behavior and how they wrote their extension to export to Excel.
Okay. The last question that we have is, when you embed a Tablix within a Tablix, can you feed a parameter to the child Tablix from the parent Tablix?
Yes. I don't know how to explain that over the phone, but yeah, so the different regions can interact with each other.
Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen.
Very interesting scenario, yeah. And that's more common when we have like other graphics other than Tablix within a Tablix. But and to remember, with, we didn't cover today, but we have lookup functions as well that could potentially be used to share information among the data sets that will represent those two Tablixes. So that could be potentially part of that solution as well.
Okay, it's 10 minutes after 12. We'll go ahead and wrap up today's webinar. I appreciate everybody's engagement in the webinar today, as I'm sure Joe does too. We are recording this, so once we stop recording, we'll make sure that we get this information uploaded to our websites and have the slide deck and notes along with expressions made available to everybody. So again, we appreciate you guys participating in our free webinar series. We do it every Tuesday and Thursday at 11 a.m. and we look forward to seeing all of you again.